Fire Force, the 8 pillars of Adolla were fated to destroy the world by triggering the second great cataclysm, Adolla being Hell. These 8 characters each possessed an Adolla burst, which is a pure flame from Hell. Each of them represents a different form of negative human emotion. But while ancient characters like Fairy and the Woman in Black had Adolla bursts of their own, they were not pillars. Each of the pillars also experienced Adolla links, sudden metaphysical connections to Adolla or other people connected to it. But these also weren't limited to pillars, since guys like Joker and Captain Burns experienced them too. But they both lost an eye in the process. Ultimately, each of the pillars were chosen by the world itself to be of great importance. And while there are only 8 of them, in theory, there could have been even more. 8 just happened to be the minimum number it would take the Great Catalysm to be successful. The pillars from 250 years ago were too few and too weak. Number 1. Amaterasu was the first pillar of madness. She has the same name as a sun goddess from Japanese mythology. The goddess's most famous story involves her self-imposed seclusion in the Heavenly Rock Cave, an act which forced all of heaven and earth into complete darkness. In Fire Force, Amaterasu was a survivor of the first great cataclysm. Her original name and who she was before is unknown. The Tokyo Empire imprisoned her in a power plant she shared a name with. So Amaterasu spent 250 years in solitary confinement as a human battery. This, as you can imagine, made her go insane. Since she's trapped for practically the whole story, we never actually see her use her ignition ability. The most we know is that it's the light of madness. In the end, when the world was remade, Amaterasu decided to embrace death. After centuries of solitude, starting over was the last thing she wanted to do. 2. Haumea was the second pillar of passivity. And like the first pillar, Haumea also shares her name with a goddess. Haumea is one of Hawaii's oldest and most important gods. She's the goddess of fertility and childbirth. Thanks to that, she was the mother of many other deities, which is a solid reflection of what Haumea was able to accomplish in Fire Force. Her 3rd generation ignition ability was unnamed, but made her an electric shock user. Haumea is easily one of my favorite electricity users of all time. Unlike the typical high-speed lethal attacker type, Haumea mostly used her powers in very creative and supportive ways. She could destroy just about any device with an electrical signal. So someone like Maki, who performed best with her iron owls, was severely weakened against her. Using electromagnetism, Haumea could safely leap from buildings by slowing her descent. Haumea's talking head technique was named after the band Talking Heads and was active since she was born. It allowed her to detect and decipher the electrical signals produced by other brains. So she always knew what other people around her were thinking and feeling. And while this was an incredibly powerful ability, especially for a tactician like Haumea, it was more of a curse than anything else. Haumea couldn't avoid hearing the dark, unfiltered thoughts of everyone around her. It seems like she was with the evangelist from the very beginning. But even if she ever wanted to leave them, it would have been pointless. She wouldn't be able to handle being in crowds or having any sort of proper social life. And at times, the mental strain was enough to drive her insane. Karan let her use him as a punching bag so she could let out her pain. And despite how devious she seemed to be over the course of the series, Haumea still managed to be saintly and remain pure of heart. Because of all her mind reading, Haumea was mentally advanced from a very young age. At just 5 years old, she was a major leader of the White Clad and even orchestrated Shin's tragic backstory. She also had a bit of a potty mouth. Because she was innately deciphering brain signals, Haumea never had a chance to be an uncomprehending baby. She knew exactly what everyone around her was trying to convey, along with what they really thought and felt. Haumea's other technique, Radiohead, which is also named after a band, allowed her to communicate with others telepathically. And the range on this one is pretty impressive. It was able to span a whole section of the city. Haumea could use her electrical signals on other people to manipulate their nerves and even control them like puppets. She could take this a step further by manipulating a body's endorphins and neurotransmitters to alter their behaviors. She casually turned Sho into an obedient little doll for most of the story. She had repelling electrical defenses that were always active. Because of them, projectiles were useless. and simply touching her would have been enough to short-circuit a person's brain. As such, unless you count being pushed into a pillar, Hameya sustained virtually no damage across the entire story. As a saint, she kept her eyes closed to the world until its final collapse. So she was effectively blind, but able to see just as well, if not better than others, thanks to electrical signals. That's like if lightning benders from the Fire Nation created a technique based on Toph's seismic sense. She could accelerate the electrical signals of her own brain. We know this thanks to her ability to better follow the high-speed fight between Shinra and Sho than Yona could. And if all that wasn't enough, Hameya could ritually summon doppelganger demons like Yami from Yu-Gi-Oh! And to an extent, she could even control demon infernals. That stuff was a bit more taxing, but rightfully so. With all the crazy things her power could do, Hameya was practically unstoppable, and could have easily handled the 8th Fire Company by her lonesome. That is, if it weren't for her two biggest weaknesses. Plasma could jam her electrical signals. Very few people could even heat their flames enough to the point of making plasma. But that was enough for Arthur to become the perfect counter against her for most of the story. That said, her power could also repel his a bit too. Her other weakness happened to be big strong men. At first, it seemed like she was just saying that to mess with Sho, but it was seriously used against her as part of the finale. Speaking of which, Hameya's strongest form was her total assimilation of humanity's collective unconsciousness, completely absorbing every mythological history ever created by humans. Now, Fire Force gets extremely meta, and our real world is what was around before the Great Cataclysm. Although humanity lost all of its religious history after the GC, Hameya became all of that combined, aka God. She became untouchable because fate said so. The fact that she didn't have to resist or respond to Shinra and Sho's attacks to avoid them is meant to emphasize her role as a pillar of passivity. By sacrificing other pillars, she also gained access to their powers. She used the power of the 7th pillar like an almighty push, and by touching down, she could exert tons of force on a certain area. Thanks to the 8th pillar, she had a move called Despair Prayer that used the Holy Soul Temple's Latom gesture as a hand seal. It seems like this was meant to be a negativity wave, but because of who she used it against, it didn't do anything. Light of Despair was a massive blast that resulted in an even bigger mushroom cloud. She had nameless beam attacks that were extremely fast and very deadly. As the human subconscious, Hameya eventually became one with the evangelist herself, and the two fused together. In her Despair Saintess form, Hameya released one tear for every creature that has ever lived on Earth. Notice how she didn't say every human. So if we're including things like bacteria and insects, we are talking about a nonillion or more tears. In fact, it has to be more, since all of this took place 250 years later than modern times. So yeah, an incomprehensible amount of tears fell from her 3 eyes. If you're a Soul Eater fan, you probably noticed a resemblance between Hameya's 3rd eye and that of the Kishins from Soul Eater. A Kishin, or demon god, was a result of a weapon eating pure human souls. And again, Hameya was a saint and the embodiment of purity. In this form, she could freely control the flames of hell. So like the Hawaiian goddess, Hameya bore the weight of the collective unconscious like a pregnancy, and with help from Shinra, she effectively served as the mother of the new world. 3. Sho Kusakabe was the 3rd pillar of apathy. Having been abducted by the White Clad and raised with no concept of familial love, Sho was disinterested in life and therefore apathetic to its end. He was the very first 4th generation pyrokinetic in history, and the reveal of his ignition ability pushed the power scaling of this series to a whole new level. Okubo had to make so many charts just to explain it. By connecting his Adolla link to the evangelist, Sho could use Severed Universe to stop time. By manipulating the heat of the expanse of the universe caused by the Big Bang, Sho could slow down time. Unfortunately, using this ability also exposed Sho to extreme cold that quickly began to freeze his body, so he could only keep it going for so long. And without the blessing of the evangelist, Sho couldn't use it. But even without it, he was still able to visually keep up with his brother's rapid technique and handle strong characters. Although Fairy's ability was a great counter to his own, Sho was able to win their fight thanks to his natural speed and skill. Sho was at his strongest when the world began to merge with Adolla. He didn't need the blessing of the evangelist anymore. Sho was part of the very first Soul Resonance in history, and like a weapon from Soul Eater, he was more of a passenger. His power was wielded, and ultimately, his brother was in charge. Number 4. Shinra Kusakabe was the 4th pillar of Rage. This guy's the main character, so you already know he has a grocery list of abilities. He was a 3rd generation pyrokinetic and eventually became a 4th generation one. Shinra's ignition ability started out simple. He could ignite and control flames from his feet. Back when he was still in the academy, Shinra scored the highest physical performance among all students. And despite being the pillar of Rage, Shinra consistently approached his fights in tactical ways that took full advantage of his quick thinking. But as the pillar of Rage, Shinra's anger only further fueled his flames. Over the course of the series, he just kept getting faster and faster. By using Tora Hishigi, Shinra developed his rapid technique to harness the flow of his life force. With it, he was able to cut down on energy expenditure and move 10 times faster than before. Korno was another hand seal he used to create explosions. It became his signature move. He even infused it with Hellfire to create a demonic maw, one that was strong enough to deal heavy damage to Karon. By exposing himself to the pressure of death, Shinra could tap into his own hysterical strength, which gave his ignition ability a whopping 70% boost across the board. His flames burned so fiercely that they turned blue and assumed a claw shape. With the power of his Adolla Link, Shinra was able to move at the speed of light. He repeatedly broke his own body down into subatomic particles and moved back in time to be whole again. He straight up defied the laws of physics. And if he ever screwed up while doing this, he would have created a black hole. As the prophesied savior of humanity born to a virgin mother, Shinra is the Jesus of the Fire Force world. Thanks to a soul resonance with Sho, a fellow pillar, and their demon infernal mother, who was the doppelganger of the evangelist, Shinra became the hero of the world, Shinra Banshoman. He became a god so mighty that even at the height of her power, Haumea could only beg him for mercy. None of her attacks had any effect on him. With a stomp, he created vegetation. He was able to spawn impossible creatures from his imagination. He caught the light of God that destroys all creatures great and small. A reference to Genesis chapter 6 verse 3 from the Bible. God's declaration of humanity and the Earth's imminent destruction. Shinra Banshoman held it like a ball and casually threw it over his shoulder. He used it to create a new atmosphere and extinguish the flames of hell. And just like that, a dark sun was turned into a healthy planet of mostly water. By touching the ground, he filled the world with abundant life. He kicked and slammed down the light of despair from the Despair Saintess to create civilization. To pull that off against a light-speed attack, he went through a ridiculous amount of time loops. He took all of her innumerable tears and turned them back into souls. Every single character who ever died in the series, from off-screen mentions to background characters, and even the very first spontaneous combustion from Chapter 1, came back to life. Many in wacky ways, but still. He made life itself less precious. He turned death itself into the god of the new world. When it came to all the despair in the world, he just destroyed it with Karna. Thanks to all this, Shinra is effectively the father of the Soul Eater world. His creation, Lord Death, stripped him and everyone else of their ignition powers, something that Shinra welcomed. Even so, in the new world, he was someone with an especially strong soul. And at the age of 42, he was the supreme leader of the World Hero Force. Number 5. Inka Kasugatani was the 5th pillar of destruction. Instead of being named after a god, she's named after the Incan Empire. During the Great Fire, Inka gained the ability to smell the path of flames as a line of light. Thanks to that, she could sense most danger ahead of time and adjust accordingly. She was actually a 4th generation pyrokinetic, And funny enough, the Incan Empire was also known as a realm of 4 parts. 2 years later, she fully awakened her ignition powers. By tracing the air, she could trigger explosions. But while she could trigger them, these pathways were totally random. She couldn't cause them to appear. And some were harder than others to unravel. But that just made them especially powerful. And because of her obsession with death, Inca wasn't bothered by the downsides at all. And although her powers are based on her sense of smell, that was surprisingly never used against her. Regardless, Inca went on to become the first witch of the Soul Eater world. Notably, the symbol on the hoodie she used to wear is reminiscent of the one the witch Medusa has on hers, a symbol that Inca's son with Shinra also had on his. Number 6. Nataku-son was the 6th pillar of fear. Nataku awakened his 3rd generation ignition powers after being bitten by a bug from hell. With them, he was able to become increasingly radioactive. Being so young and inexperienced, Nataku barely had any control over his powers. Not to mention the madman who was Black Star's ancestor running around his subconscious. Nataku was at his most dangerous while trapped inside of a fire giant. With infected imagination, Nataku created radiation symbols that released concentrated radioactive beams. And that actually killed more than a dozen people. But since he had the potential to destroy the entire Tokyo Empire, I guess it's not as bad as it could have been. Number 7. Sumire was the 7th pillar of disgust. This character still blows my mind to this day. This sweet-looking nun from Iris and Hibana's tragic backstory was actually a child-sacrificing doomsday cultist the entire time. She also really creeped me out by suddenly turning the story into live action for her backstory. As someone who was alive before the Great Cataclysm, Sumire was nearly 300 years old. But her immortality wasn't ever explained, and that just made her creepier. As a 3rd generation pyrokinetic, Sumire could amplify the heat from her body's vibrations and turn that into kinetic force, thus allowing her to create even stronger vibrations. She could easily destroy metal and cause tremors. With the power of her Adolla burst, Sumire triggered major earthquakes that shook the entire Tokyo Empire. Like Amaterasu, Sumire decided not to continue living in the Soul Eater world. Having already been around for 2 different worlds, she wasn't interested. Number 8. Iris, the 8th pillar of despair. Like the first 2 pillars, Iris also shares a name with a goddess. Iris is the name of the Greek goddess of rainbows and messenger of the gods. As Amaterasu's doppelganger, Iris was everything the first pillar dreamed of being. Iris was a 3rd generation pyrokinetic, but hadn't realized until later in life. So while it saved her from the fire at the orphanage, she never properly trained it. Once she was further connected to Adolla, Iris was able to extend her protection to others as a heated aura strong enough to resist attacks from powerhouses. After being sacrificed, Iris's powers of despair fueled Haumea's strongest attacks. Amaterasu's final wish was for Iris to live life for the 2 of them. In the end, Iris put being a nun behind her and had a son with Shinra. And that is all 8 pillars. Let us know which of them is your favorite and which is your least favorite. For me, Haumea is easily my 2nd favorite character in Fire Force, and Sumire gives me the creeps. As always, I'm Slice of Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.